this lesson, we're going to learn about plagiarism. And it'll take a little bit of time to go through this, but keep in mind that the time that we spent here is well spent. When I first started teaching, and mostly in the realm of writing, what I call Englishy stuff, my lesson on plagiarism was very simple. I would say something like, y'all know what plagiarism is, right? And, nodding all through the class. And I say, well, don't do it. And then I'd go on. But found out as I went forward for the first few years of teaching that students did it. Students plagiarized. And when I talked to them about it, they would say something like, I didn't know that was plagiarism. Well, I thought I could do that. Somebody told me that I could copy anything from Wikipedia and it wasn't plagiarism. So I thought maybe I should do a little bit more than just simply say, don't do it. So hence this expanded lesson on what plagiarism is. And to some extent, why it's bad, why you should not do it. Later, in subsequent lessons, we'll get into ways to avoid it and ways to legitimately use your research, legitimately use the words and ideas and findings of other people. But first, we'll talk about plagiarism. Oh, and as a little aside, you'll notice here the international symbol for do not plagiarize. Okay, no plagiarism allowed. So here we have a little cartoon. The term paper on the growing problem of plagiarism in society is eye-opening, especially since it's the third time I've seen it. This hits the mark here because I have had the experience of giving students an assignment, what is plagiarism, why it's bad, how to avoid it, and receiving papers back that were in fact plagiarized, which is kind of missing the point. Kind of signifies that somebody is unclear on the concept of plagiarism and why we shouldn't do it. So let's get into the topic of plagiarism. So what is it? Well, it comes from a Latin word from a couple thousand years ago, plagiarius, which means a kidnapper, a seducer, a plunderer. That was the original word, but it was applied to mostly the written word. And it has to do with the theft of other people's intellectual property. And this is important. Their intellectual property, what we call intellectual property nowadays, but has to do with their artistic creativity, their writing, sometimes their artwork, and in some cases, as we'll see as we go forward, their commercial creations, their commercial endeavors. But the fact that it's been in use, the word has been in use for more than 2,000 years, signifies to us that in the West, in Western civilization, the idea of the theft of intellectual property is a long valued violation of people's property rights. So, what is it specifically? Well, it's copying all or part and not giving credit. Okay, copying is using other people's ideas or findings and not giving credit. Okay, so not only copying word for word, but using their ideas or what we call their findings, that is what they found in their research. It's using facts that are not common knowledge. And this relates to the one just above, using their findings. So this means historical facts or statistical facts that are not common knowledge. And in a moment, I'll explain what we mean by common knowledge, okay? Or just generally not properly citing. And the properly here is important because even though you try to cite, and I'll talk about what a citation is, that is a way that you give credit, but if you don't do it correctly, that could also be deemed plagiarism. But the key phrase here that I've underlined has to do with not giving credit. Give credit where credit is due, and you can use anything, but you must give credit. So we have some examples of plagiarism. Quoting directly from a work without using quote marks. You see, so even if you try to say, as John Smith famously wrote, and then you have, a sentence or a paragraph of what he wrote, it's not enough. If you're using the exact words, you have to use quote marks, or as we'll find out in a subsequent lesson, sometimes there's a substitution for quote marks if you're using a long quote. But still, you have to signify that these are the exact words that, in our case, John Smith wrote. Cutting and pasting or copying and pasting from the internet, that's obviously plagiarism. That's quoting directly, or paraphrasing an author. A paraphrase is something that, again, we'll learn more about in subsequent lessons, but it has to do with using the gist or the main idea of a passage, but changing the words. So using a thesaurus, for instance, to change the words. And so you say, oh, I didn't plagiarize because the author said big and I said large. And still, if you follow the pattern of thought, that's still plagiarism. Or using somebody else's unique idea. You can't use somebody else's idea and claim it as your own, no more than it would be fair or legitimate for you to tell a fellow worker at your job how you might save the company $1 million a year, for instance, and then he runs off and tells the boss and he gets credit for the idea. That would be stealing somebody else's idea without saying that you're the one that came up with the idea. You see, that would be plagiarism. We'll pause for a moment and take a look at the word that I've been referring to quite a bit and will continue to do so, and that is to cite, C-I-T-E. So you see, it's not cite as in, oh, what a beautiful site that is. Oh, I see that. And it's not a site as in a location. This is a good site to put up our new shopping center. It's to cite. That is to quote a book or the source. It's one of the important things about when we're writing the type of research papers that we'll write. And this runs through whether you're doing it for school or doing it for business. You want to give a citation so your readers know how you know this, why this is true. It's not just something that you thought up. It's not an idea that just came into your head, but you have evidence for it. And so you lay down this trail of evidence, and that's your citation. So, to cite or not to cite? This is always a question that comes up. Should I cite this? There's something called common knowledge. And common knowledge is something you would expect everybody to know. There's a technical definition, and, well, varying technical definitions. Sometimes you'll read that if you can find it in 3 authoritative sources or 5 authoritative sources, the numbers vary slightly, you don't need to cite it. Or if it's common knowledge. So, for instance, the world is round. And I'm sorry to break this to you, flat earthers, but the world is round. That's common knowledge. Or San Antonio is a city in Texas, or at least the San Antonio that I'm thinking about. There might be a San Antonio in Nevada or California or New Mexico, any of the southwestern states here in the United States, or elsewhere around the world. There might be a San Antonio in Spain or Peru, but you don't need to cite that. You don't need to go to an atlas and find the page reference that places the city of San Antonio in Texas. That's common knowledge. You don't need to cite this. Also, you don't need to cite a personal opinion. So if you believe that the movie Titanic was the best movie ever made, you don't have to give a citation for that because that's your personal opinion. Now, if you say that or if you write that, you do have to back it up with something, or you should back it up with something. Why do you think that? And maybe this is part of an analysis of films. So you give your evidence for that opinion. Likewise, if you tell a story about your own personal experience, from the times when we were in grade school and we wrote a little essay, what I did on my summer vacation, to right now you're writing a serious paper and you use a personal experience to illustrate a point. You don't have to give a citation for that personal story. That's your own personal experience. But you must cite if the facts are derived from somebody else's research. Somebody else has done the research, whether it's a historian or statistical data. You don't know, say, the population of San Antonio. How do you know that? That's not common knowledge. The San Antonio is in Texas. That's common knowledge, but not what the population is. That you do need to go to whatever your source book is, whatever your source is. It could be something on the internet. Nowadays we do more and more research, more and more legitimate research on the internet, but you still have to give a source for your information. And of course, any words that are not your own. Okay, so I've covered this before, but I'll reiterate it. Any words that are not your own. Now, you don't have to give single words a citation. So if you use the word England, for instance, a lot of people have used the word England or the United States or San Antonio, but you don't have to give a citation. How you know that's a word. But usually blocks of 3 or 4 or 5 words or more, you do have to put into quotes and give a citation. And of course, any theory or idea that's not your own. So for instance, you can't just write in the paper, well, I have this idea that energy and light are related to matter. And I phrased it as E = mc squared. Well, that's not your idea. That's not your theory. That's obviously Einstein's theory of relativity. And you have to give a citation for that. You just can't pop in a theory and claim it as your own. So, where do we find plagiarism? So here we have little Billy Widmore reading a paper for his school teacher, and he wrote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. fourscore and 7 years ago, quoth the raven, nevermore." So little Billy has plagiarized these words from the classics of English literature, or 3 classics of English literature, as we see here. This is plagiarism. He's taken the words and not given credit. If you were in an art class and you turned in this painting as your own original painting, and you say, "Professor, I painted this. Isn't it wonderful?" That would be plagiarism. You're stealing somebody else's creation. It doesn't just happen in the creative arts. Here we have an example from politics. One of the things that politicians try to do is they try to make themselves appear more human. Of course, it's arguable whether they really are human or not, but we'll let that one go by for right now. But in the year 2008, John McCain was running against Barack Obama for president of the United States. And the McCain camp, or you might say John McCain, but it's probably people in his campaign, thought, I know how we can make this candidate appear more human. We'll put Cindy McCain's, that's his wife, recipes on the internet. People will like that. So it's as if Cindy McCain went to her kitchen and found a little metal box, a little metal file box, and got out a 3x5 card, a tattered 3x5 card, splattered with food from her many times that she's made this recipe, and in this case the passion fruit mousse. And they put it on the internet. And it reads, and you can read the paragraphs, the first few words of the paragraph. In a saucepan, heat the passion fruit puree. Add the gelatin to the hot juice, starts the next paragraph, and the next one, to serve the mousse. But look at what happens in the Food Network website, which appeared first. It reads, in the saucepan, heat the passion fruit puree. Add the gelatin to the hot juice to serve the mousse. And so each paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, is identical, which indicates plagiarism. And this brings up another point, too. One of the ways that we know it's plagiarized is it's almost impossible to have the same large block of text. You can have one word, and certainly if you're talking about a passion fruit mousse, you'd have those words, right? But it wouldn't be the same order of text. I've often had students say, what if I accidentally plagiarize something? And so what I've done is I've done a search for just a random sentence that we just make up on the spot. A random sentence that makes sense. Professor, what if I accidentally plagiarize something and I mean to be honest about writing my paper? You do a search for those exact words and you won't find them. In the millions and trillions of words on the internet and sentences on the internet, you won't find them. You see, we're capable of writing original material without copying anything. And that's just one sentence, but the fact that it's copied not just for one sentence, but over several paragraphs indicates that it's plagiarism, because it's just astronomically impossible to accidentally plagiarize something. But anyway, here we have a case where John McCain was caught plagiarizing, and I will add my theory, I like to joke, this is why he lost the election, because he lost the confidence of the all-important culinary vote. So, happens again in politics. Now, you might not remember, might not know, I was alive at this time, 1988, Joe Biden was running for president. And he was caught plagiarizing. You see, before he gave a speech, a particular speech, the one I'm going to talk about, Neil Kinnock, an English politician, gave a speech, and one of the things that he said in the speech is, "Why am I the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university? Was it because our predecessors were so thick?" And thick being an English word for being stupid, not being bright. And shortly after that, Joe Biden was caught giving a speech using the exact, not the exact words, but the exact idea and this exact sequence. Why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to university? It's because our fathers and mothers were not bright. You see, so here we see two important points. One is you don't need to use the exact words to be guilty of plagiarism. So that's point one. Point two is that even though I'm just showing you one sentence, the plagiarism ran more than one sentence. It was actually throughout the whole speech. Almost paragraph by paragraph was paraphrased. This is what we know as paraphrasing. Putting into your own words, but it's still plagiarism. Here's another interesting case. A fun case for us to look at, not fun for the person involved. This was a teenage author who made a massive book deal for a book that she wrote. How Opa Maida got kissed, got wild, and got a life. She'd been paid a great deal of money, and she had to give $500,000 of it back, which I think was the whole advance. Everything that she got from the book. You see, because it was discovered that she'd plagiarized the book. Now, she was a high-powered young person. She got into Harvard, probably valedictorian of her high school, lots of honors and awards, and better than a 4.0 GPA. But she was caught plagiarizing. Because one of the things that happens in the arts is people who enjoy a particular genre, and a genre is a type of a particular art. So, for instance, you like music, but you like country music. Country music is a genre. Or you like hip-hop, or you like heavy metal or something like that. And in this case, the readers of this genre, which is called chick lit, I didn't make up the term, it's just what it's called. It's literature enjoyed by young women or teenage girls, probably between the ages of 12 and 18 or 20 or something like that. So people who enjoy a particular genre of entertainment or art are knowledgeable in that field. So if you like hip-hop, you know the history, you know who the players are, you know who the main characters are, your favorite artists, and even your not favorite artists. If you like mystery novels, you know who the major writers in that field are. Well, the same with chick lit. People spotted various similarities, various disturbing similarities between Opa Maida, this Opa Maida book, and other books in the genre. So, for instance, in an original, Jack has a scar on one hand and eyes so dark they're almost black. In the plagiarized version, in Opa Maida, Sean has a scar on one hand and eyes so dark they're almost black. So you don't escape the charge of plagiarism, or this writer did not escape the charge of plagiarism, changing the name of the character to Sean from Jack. Likewise, in an original, Sabrina was a brainy angel. Yet another example how every girl had to be one or the other, pretty or smart. And in the plagiarized version, Moneypenny was a brainy female character. You see, so you would not escape the charge of plagiarism by changing the name to Moneypenny and saying female character rather than angel. So these are examples of paraphrasing. And again, it's not just two sentences in the offending novel that made the publisher go back to the writer and say, you have to give us the money back. It was that these similarities ran through the entire plagiarized book. Here we have another interesting case. This is Tsunami, titled Tsunami, and it's a famous woodcut piece of art from Japan, I think in the 1700s. Now, by itself, it's in the public domain, and anybody could use it. I mean, you can't go into the museum and just take it, but you can use the image for anything that you want. And here's an example of an ad agency creating an advertisement for Asahi beer, Japanese beer, use a famous Japanese work of art to advertise the beer. And in kind of a clever way, we have the arching tsunami wave crashing down on the Asahi beer bottle. And one of my favorite pieces of it is the use of what used to be called church keys, bottle openers, to form the parts of the wave. Well, a few years after this, another ad agency came along and used the same idea for their advertisement for Kirin beer, another Japanese beer. And you notice they didn't use the church keys. They used bubbles like bubbles on beer froth. But it's still plagiarism. And it wasn't plagiarizing the original. It was plagiarizing the first ad, the first advertisement. And this is plagiarism. Now, the result here was very similar to the teenage author of the book Opameda, because here the ad agency, which sells its ability to create original ads, original copy, original clever ideas to sell the product, was caught copying another ad. You see, so what are they selling now? They're just selling their ability to copy? Well, that isn't going to get them very many customers. And actually what happened is that ad agency had to shut down because nobody wanted to do business with them anymore because they became known as plagiarists. It happened in another realm too, that a company was caught plagiarizing. And this is a little tricky. This gets into copyright law, but just very generally. Barbie, the company that made Barbie, not Barbie herself, okay, but the company that made Barbie, Mattel, sued the company that made the Bratz dolls for plagiarism, for copyright infringement. And what happened is that somebody who used to work for Mattel, that is the Barbie people, went to work for Bratz. And that became the subject of a lawsuit that Mattel actually won. And the Bratz company, I think it was Hasbro, was found guilty of copyright infringement and was required to hand over $500 million and shut down operations. $500 million, $500 million. Now, the court case is in appeal, probably go on for another 20 years, but still, pretty stiff penalty for plagiarizing, for stealing somebody else's copyrighted ideas, for stealing somebody else's intellectual property. So why is plagiarism a serious issue? Why is it? Well, this is kind of interesting. It has to do with the general concept of academic integrity and ethics in a domain. And what I mean by that is every profession has an ethical code that is core to its doings, to its business, to its endeavors. So, for instance, money is central to a bank's operations. So when you go into the bank, you want the teller that you talk to, if anybody goes into a bank anymore, and if anybody talks to an actual live teller, but just go with me on this. I'm an old guy. I am used to going into banks and talking to people. But you want the teller to be generally ethical, right? Faithful to their spouse, not kick little animals, help old ladies across the street, But first and foremost, you want them to follow the ethic of not taking your money. In food preparation, when you go into a restaurant, again, you want all those other things. You want your server, your cook, the hostess, or the host to follow all those other ethical rules. But first and foremost, you want them to follow the ethic of not killing the customers. Like washing their hands after they go to the bathroom, things like that. Don't poison the customers. Not killing the customers is an ethic. It's an ethical responsibility. And likewise, the ethic that's central to our business, if you would, of education is academic integrity, what we call academic integrity. Because in short, what this means is that at the end of the day, when you get your degree, after all the hard work that you've done, you want people to believe that you actually know something, that you actually know how to do something. Okay, so that's what academic integrity means. It means that you went to a school that isn't known for cheating, and that the school will certify that you have not cheated, that you actually know something. That's what that academic integrity means. That's why what we call academic integrity is so central to the operations of a school, whether it's a grade school, a high school, a college, or a university, or even at the graduate level. And there is something that you sign on to when you become part of a school, which is known as a student code, and sometimes known by different names, but it's a long list of things that you will and won't do. And mainly it has to do that you will have integrity in your dealings in the school, and you sign on to it without even reading it. It's like one of those contracts when you buy a piece of software. You scroll down to the bottom and you check the list. You go, yada, 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 yeah, I agree. Just let me add my game or my app or whatever it is, and you sign off on it. In the same way, you sign off on agreeing to the student code of academic integrity. You can't cross off something and say, well, I don't agree not to plagiarize. I don't agree not to cheat. Just simply by being a member of the community and signing your admittance documents, you sign on to your agreement that you'll adhere to academic integrity. So, we're getting close to the end. It's going to start recapping. So examples of plagiarism: paraphrasing statements, paragraphs, or other pieces of work without proper citation, or using other people's ideas, or presenting work as your own that's been done all or in part by somebody else. You can't have somebody else write a paper for you. That is plagiarism as well. Or failure to properly cite. And again, in another lesson, we'll talk about what we mean by properly citing, properly referencing the works that you drew from, the works that you use, the facts that you use, the quotes that you use. How do you do that properly? Because the properly is very important too, is an important part of this. But first and foremost, you want to get the idea, the general idea of what it means to plagiarize. So, plagiarism can be intentional or unintentional, and this is important. You see, it's not an excuse to say, oh, I didn't know that was plagiarism. Well, too bad. You did it. Just like if you happen to tumble out of the 10th floor of a building, the ground doesn't care whether you intended to or not. The ground doesn't care whether you jumped, whether you were pushed, or whether you accidentally fell. You did it. You hit the ground. That's the same with plagiarism. You hit the ground. And so, intentional or unintentional, plagiarism is equally a violation. Self-plagiarism. So you can't turn in a paper that you've turned in for another class or that you wrote for another reason. So you can't steal from yourself. Now, you might be able to use the same idea. You might be able to write about the same topic. You might even quote from yourself, as I so brilliantly wrote in a paper for another class last year, and then you put in quotes and you cite it. You might be able to do that but you cannot turn the same paper in. So the idea is you cannot write one paper in your academic career and turn that in for every class. Okay, you can't self-plagiarize. You're not allowed to. And you can't make stuff up. If you're doing a research paper and you have a theory, such as, for instance, the earth is flat, and there's no scientific evidence for that, you can't make up a study. You can't say, well, the famous scientist Fred Frickenbottom discovered that the earth is really flat, and we've been suffering under a several thousand-year delusion that it's round. You can't make up that study. You can't make up your facts, either at the undergraduate level or even as a graduate student. And there's actually been cases where people who are established in their careers are so intent on proving a point, they want to advance their careers, become famous in the field, become world famous, and they've been caught making stuff up, which has just totally ruined them. So you can't do that, or you can't do it and not be guilty of plagiarism. If you do it, you're guilty of plagiarism. You can't get unauthorized assistance. There is authorized assistance. You can have somebody look at your paper and give you feedback. You might be able to have people edit your paper, for grammatical mistakes. But unauthorized assistance would be actually having somebody else write the paper or write whole sections of the paper. That would be unauthorized assistance. You can't do that. That also is plagiarism. Obviously enough, you can't steal somebody else's copyrighted material. And we talked about that earlier, right? Even as a student, you can't steal somebody else's ideas or lift words out of a book and present them as your own. You're stealing somebody else's copyrighted material. So you kind of have a double whammy there, right? It's plagiarism and it's also theft of intellectual material, which is actionable. You can actually be sued for that. You can't collude. Now, what this means is if you write a paper for somebody else, they're guilty of plagiarism, but so are you. The person who turns in that paper, unauthorized assistance, right, is guilty of plagiarism, but you're guilty of plagiarism because you've colluded with them to write that paper and to write it for them. And here's a little story that goes along with that. I once had a 3-for-1 sale. 3 instances of plagiarism with one paper. What happened is a student turned in a paper and it looked kind of funny, so I ran a plagiarism check on it. Sure enough, it appeared on the internet, so it was taken directly from the internet. And then I looked further, and it had actually been turned in for a previous class. So that's 2 instances of plagiarism right there. It's double dipping, and it's copying something from the internet. And then when I talked to the student, she was very indignant, and she said she was so angry because she trusted him not to plagiarize. Wait a second. You trusted him? You trusted somebody else to write you a paper that wasn't plagiarized. Well, that's collusion. That's 3 times. It had been copied from the internet. It had been turned in before, and somebody else had written it. That's 3 instances of plagiarism in one go. Well, you can't do any of those things. And I include this just because it tickles me. Okay? You can't say that you are going to be late on a test, or you can't come to the test, or you can't turn in the paper on time because, for instance, you have to pick up your grandmother at the airport. And there is no grandmother at the airport. So if you lie about your circumstances to get special benefits, that is plagiarism. That's technically plagiarism. Now, I've never known anybody to actually get caught on that. Nobody calls up your grandmother and say, were you at the airport? But technically, that's plagiarism. So, what are the penalties? So right here we have a teacher who discovers a plagiarized paper, and dear Mr. Trent, since you only pretended to write the paper, I'm only pretending to grade it. So don't turn in a piece of plagiarized work and then get mad because the teacher hasn't marked it up appropriately, because it's not your work. But what are the penalties? In all seriousness, what are the penalties? Most schools go by a 3-strike rule. Most schools in the United States. First, remember all incidences are reported and kept in your permanent file. The first strike, you get a 0 on the assignment. Now, the professor might allow you to redo. If the professor or the instructor or the teacher believes that you weren't quite sure what you were doing, believes there were extenuating circumstances for whatever reason, might allow you to redo the paper, sometimes with a penalty. But nevertheless, the starting point, the baseline, is a 0 on the assignment, and it goes on your permanent record. The second strike is more serious. Not only does it go on your permanent record, but you fail the class. So the school knows that this is the second strike because, again, it's on your permanent record. Third strike, you're expelled from the school. And so I always tell students, if it happens the first time, and it doesn't happen, you do it. But if you do it the first time, I always tell students, this isn't the end. You can go on. You can even pass the class. You might not have your A average. You might not have the A that you're hoping for, but you can pass the class and you go on and you learn from this and you never do it again. As you go further and further down the strikes, as you accumulate more strikes, and there aren't that many to accumulate, the penalties become much more serious. And keep in mind, this is 3 strikes throughout your entire academic career, not just 3 strikes in one class. It's not that every class you get 3 opportunities to plagiarize. Quite the opposite. So one of the reasons that I'm going through this lesson is that I hope it never happens even once. And again, maybe it's a misnomer to say it happens, because it doesn't happen. It is something that somebody does. So let's not do it. Now, one of the ways that instructors have to determine whether somebody cheated, somebody plagiarized, is through the use of plagiarism checkers. And there are several companies out there that will do this. And what they do is they search the internet, and more material is being put on the internet for duplications between your submission, the paper that you wrote, and other material on the internet, and comes up with a report. Now, in this case, the highlighted material has been plagiarized, has been copied directly from the internet. And you see, right here, we see an example of a paper that is reported to be 76% similar with other writings on the internet. 76%, that's a lot. That means that just about the only thing that's original in this paper is the name of the student and the name of the instructor. And so this is heavily plagiarized. I will note a couple different things. One, you'll notice here we have some of the references are highlighted. If you get a report back and shows the references, the source material, the titles of the articles that were researched being referenced, that is not an accurate read. You can kind of delete those from the charge of having plagiarized, because the titles of the articles that you referenced were not plagiarized. They're something that you have to put into your paper to give the source material for the claims that you make. Likewise, if you use well-known phrases in your field or in society in general, and those things are marked, and occasionally they are marked, you can discount those as being plagiarized. Those are just words. You can't be charged for plagiarism for just using words. But generally speaking, it's a report like this that your instructor will use to determine whether a paper is plagiarized or not. And very often instructors will give you access to this kind of report. Or you can find places on the internet even that have free reports like this that you can double check to make sure that you haven't, I hope, accidentally plagiarized something, forgot to put quote marks around something. Sometimes it's just a matter of forgetting to put a quote mark at one end of a quote. And so the material that should be in quotes is flagged as being plagiarized when you don't intend it to be. You meant to put the other quote mark there, for instance, but But if you do a plagiarism report for yourself, you can see where there might be an issue with typography, a typographical error. So it's always a good idea to run your own plagiarism report if it's at all possible. Because you don't want to get one of these, a notification of violation of the student code of conduct, of academic integrity violation. Again, this would go into your permanent record and be one of those strikes. And if you do receive one of these, I would hope that it would be just the first strike, and you will never get another strike ever again in your entire life. But you don't want to get one of these because it can be a negative mark on your transcript.
If you like this video, please hit the like, thumbs up below, and subscribe. Also, Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes in design, the arts, including writing, all kinds of writing, creative writing, technical writing, business, tech, and a lot of other disciplines. And you can learn cutting-edge skills, you can network with peers, you can discover new opportunities, explore new interests, develop your talents, anything you want to do. It's great. And if you click the link below for the Skillshare link, you get 2 free months that you can just try it out, do whatever you want to, take all 24,000 classes if you want to, and then quit. Don't pay a penny. And did I mention it's free? Okay, so so join up, click subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and hope to see you soon.
Skillshare is for designers, photographers, marketers, artists, and lifelong learners. Skillshare is for foodies, commuters, risk takers, the young, and the young at heart. It's for strategists, free spirits, purists, the bold, the curious, the characters, the makers, and the breakers. Skillshare is for everyone, an online learning community with thousands of classes to advance your career, improve the world, and pursue the work you love. What will you learn next? It all starts on Skillshare.